It's another week and another coincidence as we take a look at Jesus Christ as the way, the truth, and the life. Our big goal is happiness in this life and heaven in the next. To achieve this, we need to stay close to God throughout each day. But how do we do that while living in the real world with all of its challenges and distractions? Growing our interior life through Christian mental prayer is the answer. This podcast mines the riches of the greatest spiritual tradition on earth so we can grow in holiness together. I'm Steve Smith. Thank you for joining me for Pearls of the Interior Life. Welcome to this episode of Pearls of the Interior Life. Thank you as always so much for making this time for the Lord. Very glad to be a part of it. Boy, another week, and it's another coincidence. Last week, we were going to be looking at the indispensability of the resurrection. It just so happened that I came upon a video with a New Age type practitioner who was, as it was, a very good example of what happens when we try to have spirituality without the resurrection, how everything kind of unravels. Well, this week we're going to be looking more broadly at the indispensability of Christ, which obviously follows from the resurrection, but more broadly and looking at his words, I am the way, the truth, and the life. As it turns out, the coincidence now is a homily by Bp Barron that just happened to come out this past week, and I don't ordinarily follow Bp Barron, but this one was brought to my attention, and it is right there in the center of that message of the indispensability of Christ. That's what we're going to be looking at. In particular, Bp Barron was speaking to this passage from the first readings from Acts of the Apostles. He is the stone rejected by you, the builders, which has become the cornerstone. There is no salvation through anyone else, nor is there any other name under heaven given to the human race by which we are to be saved. Now, we're going to be looking at this in some points from his homily, and frankly, from a somewhat critical perspective. I think Bp Barron has much to say here that ends up being somewhat confusing, problematic. Maybe, maybe not. You may see it differently, but we can certainly learn things from it, though, and it's good fodder for discussion. So, just some general characteristics in his homily. First, he views this passage, he characterizes it as being problematic, as being troubling, as being deeply challenging for a lot of people. He doesn't clarify which those lot of people are, but that is his characterization of the passage.
And here are a few lines that I submit to you are kind of troubling for a lot of people today. Listen, I think it's important for us to let the difficulty of this text sink in. Okay, you still with me? I know. This is deeply challenging business in our culture today. Let St. Peter's speech bother you today.
Now, Bp Barron does affirm, obviously, the truth of that passage, and that salvation, indeed, is only through Jesus.
Does this make Christianity better than other religions? Well, okay, so be it. If by that you mean, yes, a claim is being made about Jesus that's made about nobody else. All right, so be it. And therefore, it's simply true what Peter says. There is no other name by which we are saved.
Bp Barron then turns to Lumen Gentium as an approach to, again, what he sees in the challenge of this passage and the characterization that comes from Second Vatican Council that there are rays of truth in other traditions of man.
So the Council Fathers talk about rays of light. It's a lovely little expression. As you look at Buddhism or Hinduism, or you look at Islam or Judaism and other religious philosophies, can we see rays of light? Yeah, elements of truth and goodness and beauty in them. How should we read those? As participations in the fullness of light found in Jesus Christ.
And you see, Bp Barron, he particularly focuses on words of fullness and participation, that the fullness of salvation just comes through Christ. And I guess the question is, how do we participate in that? Here, as he often does, he looks to other giants in the faith to kind of advance this, it seems. And here he turns to John Henry Newman, and he looks at what Newman refers to as our conscience, as the aboriginal vicar of Christ, sort of dwelling within us.
Newman spoke of the conscience, in his beautiful language now, as the aboriginal vicar of Christ in the soul. So when my conscience speaks to me, says, do this, don't do that, and I, in good faith, am following the prompt of my conscience, what am I in fact following? Even though I might not fully know it, I'm following, in fact, the voice of Christ.
And so it seems kind of more universally, he's looking at our conscience as that source of tapping into the salvation without necessarily being a part of the church that Christ established. On a side note, I say Bishop Barron seemed somewhat preoccupied with what I'd say is this straw man of scripture like this being used as an entree to violence, almost conversion by the sword, if you will.
Furthermore, it seems to play into a lot of our worst religious instincts, namely us against them. Wouldn't this give rise, people might say, to a sort of, religious violence? We're the inside group, everybody else is outside. If we have to use violence to bring them in, why not? Does this mean that I can engage even in violence against those who don't hold faith in Christ? But it doesn't mean we have to succumb to a sort of aggressive exclusivism. But never allow yourself to use St. Peter's speech as an excuse to attack or exclude or belittle others.
So what to make of this? First, a couple of general comments and then 4 particular points. But general comments, one, just in my own articulation of things, could be right, could be wrong. But I believe the point of the church on this, the teachings in the Catechism, the teachings from the Second Vatican Council, is that salvation only comes through Christ. Were it not for Christ and his incarnation, salvation is not possible. Had Christ not been born, dwelt among us, suffered, died, resurrected, it wouldn't matter what we did, how well we followed our conscience or anything else. The door to salvation is closed. It's only through Christ. Then the argument is that in certain circumstances, there are ways we can get access to that salvation, where, for instance, through no fault of our own, where we are not aware of that reality and that necessity of Christ, but we still do our best to follow truth, to follow Christ's truth through our conscience. For example, everybody knows at some deep level that the taking of innocent life is wrong. So when we follow that natural law in our heart, that is the path to Christ if we have not been brought to that fullness of truth in any other way. That's my probably somewhat awkward wording of things. And then just my general curiosity is who Bishop Barron is addressing his homily to. I recommend listening to his whole homily, by the way, but who he is addressing it to. Who are the people that are so disturbed and troubled by these words? And they're challenging words, no doubt about it. I think the challenge is how do we communicate this out to a world that does not know or accept Christ? But it's a different matter if these words are troubling to ourselves in our heart. I'm not sure exactly who he's directing these things to or how he's expecting them to be put into play, but he's certainly expecting people to really be doing a lot of hand-wringing. Here are 4 particular points for consideration. The first is, it must be said plainly, so we should always speak plainly. I find Bishop Barron to be a source for confusion. I don't think intentional on his part, but certainly is some examples from the past. One, in his interview with Ben Shapiro, when he describes Christ as the privileged way, which seems to be a precursor to where we are now. In his homily, I think he's advanced that a bit. Or in his interview with Dave Rubin, when he demurred, just speaking plainly about the real challenges and errors with transgenderism, the harm that's done by that, or perhaps most notably with his comments about the reasonable hope that all men were saved. And I understand where he was going with that, but that's a different topic perhaps for another episode. But his initial articulation came out more, a reasonable hope is more likely than not, more than a 50% chance. And later on, he walked that back if you watch the evolution of it. And he just talks about reasonable hope in that we have our power of reason, our intellect. And we can look at God and look at a few very obscure theologians like Ursman and Balthazar and say, yeah, there's some reason we can maybe think all men are saved, even if it's a really tiny likelihood, not a greater than not. At any rate, he may be right in all these things, but these are really very subtle questions, and they can do quite a bit of harm. And he brings in a lot of ambiguity. Maybe it's just because he is clearly a tremendous intellectual power, and he has so much knowledge that he's bringing at these things, and he's doing this subtle, nuanced thinking. Generally, these things aren't that subtle and nuanced, frankly. But here again, I think he just brings in a great deal of potential for confusion, which brings us to point number 2, our conscience. There are 2 very important aspects of our conscience: the effects of the fall, and thus what it takes to properly form and support and follow a well-formed conscience. Here's how the Catechism puts it. This is 1783. The conscience must be informed and moral judgment enlightened. The education of conscience is indispensable for human beings who are subjected to negative influences and tempted by sin to prefer their own judgment and to reject authoritative teachings. And it continues on from there, and actually then back at the beginning where it's talking about the nature of man, somewhere around paragraph 400, there's quite a bit more on that. The point being that our conscience, it's not a given that it's leading us in the right direction. Far from it. It's the exact opposite of that. Without a great deal of effort on our side to get on our side, our effort is always to let God do his work in us. But without that, all of those layers upon layers that we heap on top of it, who knows where our conscience is leading us. We were talking about this last week, actually, that even the worst person in the world, a mass murderer, does what they do thinking they're doing something good, because they have so many layers of sin and error and deception that deaden that conscience, that they can't even get down. We said deep down, everyone knows the taking of innocent life is evil. Well, deep down, yes, their conscience, that aboriginal vicar, is speaking that natural law to him, but it is so deeply buried and repressed, they can't hear that anymore. They're convinced what they're doing is good. That little voice in their head is saying, yes, take that next life. And then on top of that, we have the enemy, the child of destruction, who conceals himself as a child of light, whispering in the ear, yeah, that's a great idea, do that. So yes, we have that conscience. And St. John Henry Newman, who he's quoting here, he knew this very well. Here's some additional writings from the great saint. Conscience has rights because it has duties, but in this age, with a large portion of the public, it is the very right and freedom of conscience to dispense with conscience, to ignore a lawgiver and judge, to be independent of unseen obligations. It becomes a license to take up this or that and let it go again. Now, in his defense, Bishop Barron does quickly make a statement to the effect that, yes, we follow our conscience, to the extent that it's guiding us to truth, goodness, and beauty. But again, the point is, we can have very misguided ideas of what are truth and goodness and beauty. And don't we see that playing out in the church, by the way? It is that misguided conscience that allows our church to have a Pachamama idol at the Vatican. It is that misguided conscience that has led to the endless summers of shame, it seems, with all of this, the sexual deviancy It is that misguided conscience that has the church mistaking ecological sins for the true grave moral evils of our time. It is that misguided conscience that has the church cozying up to socialism and the Great Reset. It is that misguided conscience that has the church having a health forum that has a who's who of all kind of nuts there. The usual celebrities, leftists, secularists, New Ages, you name it, just about everyone you want to have leading a health conference. It's the inmates running the asylum. Citizen caution, Bishop Barron can lead to great confusion. In charity, he may be trying to illuminate these passages, but this is not something to just kind of throw out there on the fly, as it were. When you look, by the way, at Lumen Gentium, you also have to look at ad gentes. I'm not great in my Latin. You have to look at the Catechism of the Catholic Church. They are very cautious with looking at those rays of truth in other traditions of man and recognizing the fallen nature of the world. So just this kind of blind pointing to conscience with one or two extractions from St. John Henry Newman, that's concerning. Third point, what's the real point of all this is heaven. Who gets into heaven? You have to remember, wide is the path to destruction. Narrow is the path that leads to salvation. That's why the topic for today was originally going to be Christ saying, I am the truth, the way, and the life. The way, the truth, and the life, and how those three relate to each other. Maybe we'll follow up with that more in the emails or next week. But that always has to be the focus. The teaching of the doctors of the church, of the theologians, is that ultimately we are the ones who condemn ourselves to hell. C.S. Lewis, Frank Sheed, they put this very well. There's something indelible in the nature of our soul that once it comes to that point of making our final election, when God presents himself to us at that time of our judgment, it's really a question of whether we recognize him as a God we want to spend eternity with. And if we've spent our whole life just following our own self, our own misguided conscience, it's really hard. And I've known a few people, I know a few people who have an amazing ability. They're far from the Lord. They're pretty much dying-the-wool atheists, and they do seem to have that tremendous, and it's still grace. It's prevenient grace, a special type of grace. It's always God's grace to do something good. Somehow they are very tied in to their inner compass, that natural law. That being said, even then, when we get used to just following our way, our conscience, it can make it very hard to recognize God when it comes to that time. That's the challenge that we all face. But that's what this is always all about, getting souls to heaven. And the path to that is Christ, period. And that's what we always have to be working for, and avoiding all confusion. Yeah, we also want to avoid just discouragement and darkness, and we want to look for hope wherever we can find it. But obscuring issues doesn't really help. Then the last thing, what really is the concern here then? As said, I don't know who Bishop Barron is intending for his audience, who he thinks are doing the hand-wringing over this. Hopefully for any well-formed Christian, those words in themselves aren't a problem. In fact, for any well-formed Christian, one, they should be a source of joy. Praise the Lord, literally, that we've been brought to you, that we've found the way, the truth, and the life. And they should be then an encouragement to go out and share. And that is where I do think there can be a lot of challenge in this, because every one of us know people, probably people very close to us, probably people in our family who are far from the Lord, who are fallen away. And many of them probably started out in the faith and have made a conscious decision. There's that word, conscience decision to turn from that path. And boy, that is hard. How do we respond to that? That's a whole nother episode, obviously, and it's very difficult. It's obviously not just taking this passage and whacking them over the head with it. It's certainly in love. It's by example. I personally believe in this day and age, as now everything is so much against us, even our example may not look loving to them. They may look at the choices that we make the people we vote for, the things we do or do not participate in, and say, well, that doesn't look great to me. I think we're at a point where often the best we can do is pray and sacrifice for them, and that takes a lot. That takes a lot. How much are we willing to sacrifice for other people? How many lunches are we going to go without? How many little indulgences? How many extra crosses are we willing to take on? How much more of our free time are we willing to give up on our knees in another rosary? That's what is really required to get that grace flowing in other people, to turn them back to the Lord. I believe that's my opinion on this, but that I think is where the real challenge is with these words, is what we fear they mean for people who are close to us and who are, it seems, moving away from the Lord. Well, kind of a rambling session here today, but hopefully there's something in here of use. I do recommend looking up that, watching the video for yourself that was done by Bishop Barron. And you can look up when Pope Francis put out, I think it was Amoris Laetitia, he talks about conscience. And again, he just makes this bland appeal to following our conscience. And there were many things written in response to that. You can just look up Amoris Laetitia and conscience, and there will be articles that will talk about this distinction that, we can't just blindly follow our conscience. It must be well formed. And again, that's where there's potential for error here. So we'll follow up more on this one way or another in the emails. And I hope that you're still continuing to have a wonderful Easter season, growing closer to He who is the way, the truth, and our life. And I look forward to being with you again.